Cycle Breaker. Nobody Taught Us Boundaries, Part 1. How We Learn to Love Without Limits. Welcome back to Healing Both Sides. I'm Christina Fox. We're continuing our Cycle Breaker series, where we're looking honestly at the patterns that can travel through families and generations, and what it takes for us to finally say, "This stops with me." Some of these conversations will speak more directly to addiction and recovery. Some will speak more to the people who love someone struggling with addiction, and many will speak to both. But I want to make something clear as we move through this series. Cycle breaking isn't just about addiction. These conversations can apply to anyone's life. Maybe addiction isn't part of your story at all. Maybe your cycle is unhealthy relationships, poor boundaries, or never being taught boundaries in the first place, childhood trauma, abandonment, abuse, neglect, people-pleasing, anger, silence, constantly rescuing other people, avoiding difficult conversations, or simply repeating behaviors you watched growing up because nobody ever showed you another way. We all have patterns. Some were handed down to us. Some we learned by watching the people around us. Some developed because we were trying to survive what was happening in our lives. And some we've repeated for so long that we don't even recognize them as patterns anymore. That's why breaking cycles isn't about finding someone to blame. It's about being willing to look honestly at what we inherited, what we learned, what we've experienced, and even the patterns we've created ourselves, and deciding what we no longer want to carry forward. So wherever you're coming from, I want you to listen for your cycle. Because you don't have to have addiction in your story to recognize that something in your life needs to change. And some of these conversations may be uncomfortable. That's okay. We're going to talk about the things people and families sometimes don't talk about. We're going to have compassion for where these patterns came from while still holding ourselves accountable for what we do with them now. Because we may not have started the cycle, but we can decide what happens next. Nobody taught us boundaries. I want to start today's conversation with something really simple. Were you actually taught boundaries? Not. Did somebody tell you to behave? Not. Did your parents have rules? Not. Were you punished when you crossed a line? I'm asking, did anybody actually teach you what a healthy boundary was? Did someone teach you that you could say no to somebody you loved? That another person's disappointment wasn't automatically yours to fix? That you could love somebody and disagree with them? That you weren't responsible for managing another adult's emotions? That you didn't have to explain yourself until somebody finally approved of your decision? That helping someone and taking responsibility for them weren't the same thing? That being related to someone didn't give them unlimited access to your time, money, home, energy, or peace? Did anybody teach you that? Because nobody taught me. And the more conversations I have and the more stories I hear, the more I realize a whole lot of us weren't taught either. So why are we acting like everybody should automatically know this? That's something I've really started thinking about. We tell people, you need boundaries. Okay, what does that mean? Stop enabling. Okay, how? You have to detach. What does that actually look like when this is my child? Just say no. And then what do I do with the guilt after I say it? What do I do when they cry? What do I do when they're angry? What do I do when my entire family tells me I'm wrong? What do I do when I can't sleep because I'm wondering whether my no put them in danger? What do I do when every belief I've ever had about love tells me that I'm supposed to help? Nobody talks enough about that part. We're giving people instructions without acknowledging that some of those instructions contradict everything they learned about family. Think about what many of us were taught. Maybe nobody said the word boundary, but they did say, family comes first. Blood is thicker than water. You don't turn your back on family. That's your mother. That's your father. That's your child. That's your brother. You only get one family. Forgive and forget. Keep the peace. Don't air family business. What happens in this house stays in this house. Respect your elders. Be the bigger person. You don't abandon your kids. Now think about what can happen when those beliefs exist without boundaries. Family comes first can become, Everybody comes before me. Forgiveness can become. I have to keep allowing the same behavior. Respect your elders can become. I'm not allowed to say when an older family member hurts me. Keep the peace can become. I have to stay silent. Don't abandon your kids can become. I have to save my adult child from everything. Being the bigger person can become. I'm always responsible for fixing the relationship. Those beliefs may have started somewhere loving, but without boundaries, love can start asking us to tolerate things that aren't healthy. I saw this in my own family. My grandma, as I have said many times and will probably say many more, was one of the most important people in my life. I've talked about her before in this series because when I started looking at generational patterns, I realized how much I learned simply by watching her. My grandmother's world was her family. She didn't travel much. She didn't need some huge social life. Her family was everything to her. And one thing she said that I will probably hear in my head for the rest of my life was, "You don't abandon your kids." I know part of why that statement carried so much weight in our relationship. She knew what it meant for a child to feel abandoned, and she loved her children fiercely. She loved me fiercely. She loved my children. If we needed her, she was there. And looking back today, I can see tremendous love in that. But I can also see something else. I don't think my grandmother was taught boundaries either. She helped because that's what family did. As her children became adults, she continued helping. Financially, emotionally, practically. If there was a need and she could meet it, she often did. And there were situations where, from my perspective looking back, people were able to take far more from her than they should have. I'm intentionally not making this conversation about assigning motives to anyone else. I can't tell you exactly what another person thought they were doing. I can tell you what I witnessed. And what I witnessed was a woman who loved her family so deeply that saying no was incredibly difficult. There were financial situations where she could have drawn a very hard line. She didn't. There were things she could have pursued legally. She wouldn't, because at the end of the day, that was her child. And I think that's something many parents listening right now understand immediately. You can know somebody did something wrong. You can be angry. You can feel taken advantage of. You can know there should be consequences. And then another voice says, "But that's my child." That's where boundaries get complicated. We can love someone and still make it easy for them to cross us. That's difficult to say, but it's true. If somebody learns that every time they overspend, you'll pay, they may come back. If every crisis results in you fixing it, they may call you during the next one. If they take something and there is never a consequence, they learn something from that too. This isn't necessarily because there's some horrible, manipulative person sitting around planning how to use you. Human beings learn patterns. What happens when I do this? What happens when I ask? What happens when I push? And we teach each other what happens next, sometimes without saying a word. Grandma wasn't weak. I want to make that very clear. Because when people talk about somebody who struggled to set boundaries, they can make them sound weak. My grandmother wasn't weak. She survived things that would break a lot of people. She experienced enormous grief. She worked. She raised a family. And for the most part, she raised me. She was strong. But strength in one area doesn't automatically mean we have skills in another. You can be incredibly strong and still not know how to set a boundary. You can be intelligent, successful, independent, hardworking, generous, loving, and still feel guilty saying no. Because boundaries are a skill, and skills usually have to be learned. What if nobody before them knew either? That's where the generational piece becomes important. I don't know that my grandmother's mother sat her down and taught her boundaries. I seriously doubt it. And who taught her mother? We can keep going backward. There were generations where family survival depended heavily on family. People lived closer. Families shared resources. Women often had fewer financial choices. Mental health wasn't talked about the way it is today. Trauma wasn't discussed. Addiction was hidden. Children were expected to obey adults. Family business stayed inside the family. You handled things. You survived. So maybe expecting previous generations to hand us emotional tools they were never given themselves isn't entirely fair. That doesn't mean we continue unhealthy patterns. It means we understand where they may have come from. Understanding isn't excusing. It's how we stop blaming long enough to learn. Then we inherit the belief. Nobody had to teach me. Christina, you should always rescue the people you love. I watched. I absorbed. Family takes care of family. Mothers take care of their children. You don't abandon your kids. And when my own children struggled, those beliefs didn't suddenly disappear. They got louder because now addiction was involved. Now, we're not talking about somebody asking for grocery money. We're talking about, what if my child dies? Try putting a boundary around that fear when nobody ever taught you boundaries to begin with. That's what we're asking loved ones to do. And then we wonder why they struggle. Fear makes boundaries even harder. This is why addiction complicates everything. If your adult child calls and says, I spent all my money. Can you pay my phone bill? Maybe saying no feels possible. But what if they say, I'm sleeping outside tonight? Different feeling. What if they're using fentanyl? What if they're in a dangerous neighborhood? What if they've overdosed before? What if they tell you they're going to hurt themselves? Now every boundary comes with, what if? What if I say no and this is the night something happens? That's why I have enormous compassion for parents and loved ones who are caught in this cycle. Because sometimes we aren't choosing between something that feels right and something that feels wrong. We're choosing between two things that both hurt. Help and wonder if we're enabling. Don't help and wonder if we're abandoning. That's an awful place to live. And then somebody says, you need better boundaries. They're probably right. But that sentence alone isn't enough. Because what the parent sometimes hears is, let your child suffer. Or, stop loving them. Or, walk away. And then we wonder why they shut down. Maybe before teaching boundaries, we need to say, I understand why this is hard. Your fear makes sense. Your love is real. Your desire to protect them is real. And you still may need to learn a healthier way to respond. Those things can exist together. Boundary does not mean I don't love you. This deserves repeating throughout this entire conversation. A boundary isn't, I don't love you anymore. It isn't, I don't care what happens to you. It isn't, you're on your own forever. It isn't automatically, I'm cutting you out of my life. Sometimes a boundary sounds like, I love you, but I won't give you money. I love you, but you cannot use drugs in my home. I love you, but I won't lie for you. I love you, but I won't allow you to scream at me. I love you, but I can't solve this problem for you. Notice something? The love didn't leave. The behavior changed. And boundaries aren't just for loved ones. This is where we have to talk about both sides. Someone in recovery may have grown up without boundaries too. Maybe they were never allowed to say no. Maybe adults went through their things. Maybe nobody respected privacy. Maybe yelling was normal. Maybe everybody knew everybody else's business. Maybe affection was conditional. Maybe they learned that family gets unlimited access because they're family. Then they enter recovery and somebody tells them, you need boundaries. They're learning too. Maybe for the first time in their life, they have to say, I can't be around you while you're using. I can't go to that house anymore. I can't lend you money. I can't answer every call. I can't have this conversation while you're screaming at me. I don't want to talk about that right now. And suddenly the family gets offended. Oh, now you have boundaries? Yeah, maybe now they do. And that's okay. Sometimes people begin learning boundaries when they begin healing. Recovery can change relationships. Therapy can change relationships. Personal growth can change relationships. And the people around us don't always like it. Because the version of us without boundaries may have been easier for them. That's another elephant in the room. Sometimes people benefit from us having no boundaries. That doesn't automatically mean they're malicious. But let's call it what it is. If I have unlimited access to your money, I benefit from you not having financial boundaries. If you always babysit when I ask, I'd benefit from you never saying no. If you always listen while I scream, I'd benefit from you having no communication boundary. If you always clean up my crisis, I'd benefit from you continuing to rescue. If I can guilt you until you change your answer, I'd benefit from your guilt. So when you finally change, I lose something, and I might not like that. Their reaction doesn't automatically tell you whether your boundary is healthy. This is huge. Some of us decide whether our boundary was right based on how the other person reacts. They're angry. Maybe I was too harsh. They're crying. Maybe I should change my mind. They stopped talking to me. Maybe I need to apologize. They called me selfish. Maybe I am selfish. But think about that. If the person most affected by your boundary gets to determine whether you're allowed to have it, is it really your boundary? Someone can dislike your boundary. Someone can be hurt by it. Someone can disagree with it. Someone can misunderstand it. And that doesn't automatically mean the boundary is wrong. Why do we over-explain? This is something I have done, and I see people do it constantly. We don't just say, no. We say, no. And here's why. And I'm really sorry, and I hope you understand, and I don't want you thinking I don't care, and maybe another time, and please don't be mad. We turn a boundary into a court case. Why? Because we're not just communicating our decision. We're trying to get the other person to approve it. We want them to say, oh, okay, I completely understand. You're right. Then we can feel okay about saying no. But what happens when they don't? We start negotiating against ourselves. Maybe you learned that other people's feelings were your responsibility. Where does that come from? Maybe you grew up keeping somebody calm. Maybe one parent had a temper. Maybe you learned not to upset mom. Maybe dad stopped speaking to everyone when he was angry. Maybe you were the peacekeeper. Maybe you learned to read the room before you ever learned to read yourself. Maybe you became incredibly good at anticipating everybody else's needs. And now, as an adult, somebody being upset with you feels dangerous. So you fix it. You apologize. You back down. You say yes. Not necessarily because you changed your mind, because you need their discomfort to stop. That's another pattern. Boundaries can trigger old survival responses. That's why this isn't simply about learning the right words. You can know exactly what boundary you need and still feel physically sick setting it. Your heart races. Your stomach turns. You can't sleep. You replay the conversation. You wonder if you're cruel. You want to send another text explaining yourself. You want to call and make everything okay. Your mind says, this is healthy. Your body says, this is dangerous. Why? Because maybe somewhere in your history, keeping other people happy actually did keep you safe. That's why we have to get emotionally ready for boundaries. Otherwise, we learn the words, but can't hold them. Sometimes no feels like abandonment on both sides. Think about this. The loved one says, I can't keep giving you money. They feel, I'm abandoning my child. The person struggling hears, my mother doesn't care about me anymore. Both people are experiencing abandonment around the same boundary. That doesn't necessarily mean anybody is actually being abandoned. It means the boundary is touching something deeper. Fear, history, attachment, trauma, family beliefs. That's why our next conversation needs to go deeper into the difference between boundaries and abandonment. Because if we don't understand that difference, we're going to keep confusing love with unlimited access. You can be a loving person with limits. Maybe that's the first thing we need to relearn. Love doesn't require unlimited access. Love doesn't require unlimited money. Love doesn't require unlimited chances. Love doesn't require accepting abuse. Love doesn't require fixing every crisis. Love doesn't require answering every phone call. Love doesn't require agreeing. Love doesn't require sacrificing your health. Love doesn't require destroying yourself. And having limits doesn't make your love less real. Healthy love needs room for two people to exist, not one person consuming the other. Maybe grandma didn't know another way. When I think about my grandmother today, I don't think she should have known better. I think, who would have taught her? Maybe nobody. And that changes the way I look at the entire thing. Because then I can stop judging what she didn't know and start asking what I know now. I have language she didn't have. I have resources she didn't have. I have access to information she didn't have. I've worked professionally around addiction. I've lived through it personally. I've learned about boundaries, and I've still struggled to hold them. So imagine how difficult it was for generations who didn't even have the language. That gives me compassion. But compassion doesn't require continuation. I can understand why something happened and still decide it stops with me. That's what we're doing here. We're not blaming grandma. We're not blaming mom. We're not blaming dad. We're not blaming the person struggling with addiction. We're looking at the pattern because maybe nobody knew. Maybe everybody was doing what they believed love required. Maybe everybody was surviving with the tools they had. And maybe some of those tools don't work anymore. Now we get to learn something different. Before we can build healthy boundaries, though, we have to untangle them from some very old beliefs. That saying no is selfish. That someone's anger means we did something wrong. That being needed makes us valuable. That family gets unlimited access. That protecting ourselves means hurting somebody else. And perhaps the biggest one, that setting a boundary means abandoning someone. It doesn't. But I know saying that and believing it are two completely different things. So that's where we're going next. In part 2, we're going to talk specifically about boundaries versus abandonment. What abandonment actually looks like. What boundaries look like. Why they can feel exactly the same when you're afraid of losing someone. And how we begin separating. I love you from I am responsible for you. Because before I teach you how to build a boundary, I want you to understand why you are allowed to have one. Before we end today, I want to leave you with something to think about. What part of this cycle belongs to you to break? Not your child's part, not your parents' part, not your partner's part, yours. Because we can spend years waiting for someone else to change before we allow ourselves to heal. But cycle breaking doesn't require everyone in the family to start at the same time. Sometimes it starts with one person who tells the truth, who gets help, who chooses recovery, who sets the boundary, who stops rescuing, who deals with the trauma, who says, I'm not carrying this forward anymore. And that person might be you. I thank you for spending this time with me. To connect, please visit ChristinaFoxAuthor.com. From there, you can explore my books, listen to the podcast, read the blog, subscribe to my newsletter, and connect with me across all of my social media platforms. Remember, you may not have started the cycle, but you can be the one who changes what happens next. I'll see you next time.